By then, Jong-in was in such a weakened, traumatized state, not only physically but psychologically, that she no longer cried. Not when her bones were broken. Not when her tiny body was covered in bruises. Not even as her stomach silently filled with blood. She had no tears left to give. Severe malnutrition and exhaustion had drained her strength. Her body was simply too weak to sob. The violence she endured had trained her into silence. Every cry answered not with comfort, but with more pain. And so she learned the cruelest lesson, that crying only made it worse. Her silence was not peace. It was the silence of a child whose body could no longer fight, and whose spirit had been taught that no one was coming to save her. Prosecutors demanded the death penalty for the adoptive mother. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered, shouting for justice. At her first trial, she was sentenced to life in prison. Yet the tragedy that brought us to this moment began long before, with a little girl named Jong-in. South Korea had more than 30,000 reported cases of child abuse in 2019, over 40 of them ending in the death of a child. A staggering rise from just 5,578 cases in 2008, according to the Ministry of Health. Behind every number is a story. One of them is about a little girl in Seoul. In the quiet frame of an ordinary family, we remember 16-month-old Jong-in, a child whose laughter vanished far too soon. A child who should have grown up surrounded by love, safety, and warmth. This story follows the fragile thread of her short life, tracing the moments when the calm began to crack. From the very start, Jong-in's life was marked by movement. She was separated from her birth mother soon after birth, cared for by a foster caregiver, before finally being welcomed into a new home. She was around 8 months old when she entered this adoptive family, a household with their biological daughter already in its care. To outsiders, it was the picture of a family expanding with hope, bringing in another little soul to love. The adoption was arranged through Holt Children's Services and approved by the family court. The agency later stated it had conducted the usual counseling and home visit checks, and a government inspection afterwards reported no procedural faults. Though, in hindsight, the adequacy of that oversight has been sharply criticized. But within months, small details began to raise questions. At her daycare, teachers started to notice marks, bruises on her face, ears, and limbs. They voiced their concerns, filing police reports. Yet the investigations ended quickly, dismissed for lack of clear evidence. A second report came later from a citizen who said the child had been left alone in a car for over an hour. Once again, the system responded with hesitation, and the matter quietly faded. By late summer, Jong-in's attendance at daycare dropped sharply. For nearly 2 months, she was almost never there. When she finally returned, her teachers were alarmed. She was thinner. Her energy seemed drained, and her small frame carried more bruises than before. It was a change you could see and feel, the kind that sends a chill down your spine. But again, no rescue came. It's in these quiet stretches, in the spaces between phone calls and reports, that the tension grows. You start to wonder, at what exact moment did things begin to go wrong? How far back does this trail of missed chances really go? Jong-in's early life had been calm, but the fragments that followed, the odd absences, the unexplained injuries, the muted warnings, began to form a story that didn't sit right. And then, there's the family itself. 2 parents stepping into the role of raising both a biological child and an adopted one. What emotional pressures, unspoken expectations, or internal conflicts might have been building inside that home? The adoptive mother? What past shaped her? What stressors lingered beneath her outward role? The adoptive father, a television station employee balancing work, demands with the pressures of a young family and the public image that came with his position. Even the dynamics between the sisters may have carried a quiet tension. A new sibling can be a source of joy, but also competition for affection. Was the home always peaceful? Or were there subtle moments, glances across the dinner table, strained silences, a shift in the way a child was spoken to, that hinted at something unsettled? By now the threads are in place, a young child moving between caretakers, welcomed into a home that looked stable from the outside. Early signs of harm noticed by attentive eyes but not acted upon with force, and an invisible weight pressing in from within the family walls. We don't yet see the full picture, but the pieces are there, waiting. And soon the story will move from uneasy whispers to something far harder to turn away from. October 13, 2020, began like any other autumn morning in Yangcheon-gu, Seoul. But inside one home, 16-month-old Jong-in was already in crisis. Her body was frail, her movements sluggish. The day before, at daycare, teachers had seen her unable to stand without collapsing. She wouldn't drink water without coughing. The staff called her adoptive mother, who came briefly but left again, telling them there was nothing to worry about. That night, no one outside the household saw her again. By morning, the adoptive mother began filming the child in their apartment. Between 8:46 and 9:01 a.m., short clips showed Jong-in attempting to walk, her gait unstable, her face marked with bruises. Her small cries were met not with comfort, but impatient commands to walk properly. Minutes later, neighbors heard heavy thuds, 4 or 5 impacts, like weights hitting the floor. A neighbor knocked, concerned, but the mother brushed it off with an apology. At 10:19 a.m., she dropped her biological daughter at daycare and stopped at a lingerie store. Jong-in was not with her. Sometime afterward, she hailed a taxi. In the back seat lay the toddler, limp, pale, lips turning blue. The driver urged an ambulance call. She refused. By the time they reached the ER, the child was in cardiac arrest. In the ER, the fight begins and ends fast. Doctors fought through 3 separate cardiac arrests, bringing her back twice before the final collapse. After the last, the monitor held its flat line. What remains is a body that tells a brutal story. Imaging shows the abdominal cavity flooded with blood, a catastrophic internal hemorrhage. The pancreas is torn, nearly transected. The pancreas isn't an organ you'd expect to see injured. It sits deep inside the abdomen, tucked safely behind the stomach and cushioned by the rib cage and surrounding tissue. That hidden position is why damage to it almost always means one thing: the force was extreme. To tear a pancreas, blunt force has to drive the stomach backward against the spine, crushing the pancreas in between. This can happen in high-speed car crashes, severe falls, or, in the most harrowing cases, repeated blows or stamping to the abdomen. The impact doesn't just bruise the surface. The pressure can split the gland's delicate tissue, sometimes nearly cutting it in two. And when that happens, digestive enzymes spill into the abdominal cavity, starting to break down the body's own tissues while internal bleeding spreads silently inside. In medicine, such an injury is a red flag, not just for the severity of the trauma, but for the violence that must have caused it. She also had multiple fractures map across bones such as ribs, a collarbone, limbs, some fresh, some already healing when they were rebroken. Forensic examiners noted that the collarbone fracture was unlikely to result from an accidental fall in a toddler of her age. It required significant blunt force, such as a direct blow to the shoulder or chest, or violent yanking that stressed the joint. It fit the wider pattern of deliberate injury. Her inability to walk the day before, the wobbling legs that gave way beneath her, had a grim explanation. The abdominal trauma and massive internal bleeding had left her severely weakened, while older fractures in her legs and hips caused pain and instability. Even standing would have been exhausting, each step sending shocks of pain through already damaged tissue. Bruises lie thick on the face, ears, neck, torso, and thighs. Inside the mouth, burn wounds. the telltale rawness consistent with food given while dangerously hot. To the medical team, nothing about this looks like an accident. It looks like repeated harm, escalating over time. Police are called immediately. The case transfers to violent crimes detectives. The National Forensic Service schedules a full autopsy. On the table, the findings align with what the ER suspected: death from severe blunt abdominal trauma. The force, the pathologist notes, is consistent with stamping or comparable heavy impacts, the kind of blows that can rupture a pancreas and split blood vessels. In the scan of injuries old and new, another grim detail surfaces, evidence of a separate severe assault 3 to 5 days prior. The timeline puts that earlier trauma across a holiday period when the parents were home. This was not one bad moment, it was a pattern. Detectives start where the body points them. They secure the apartment and collect anything that might speak: clothing, utensils, towels, the child's dishes. They pull CCTV from the lobby, the street, the daycare, the shop. They log phone location and message data. They interview the taxi driver, the ER staff, the neighbors, the daycare teachers. Each account adds a layer: the blue lips in the cab, the thuds through the wall, the way she could not stand at daycare the day before. Then they open the family's devices, and the case darkens further. On phones and storage, investigators find hundreds of short videos, more than 800 clips in total, documenting the child's days inside that home. Not all show violence. Many revealed acts of unmistakable cruelty. Hitting her in the armpits, targeting a tender area to cause pain without immediate visible bruising. Grabbing her by the neck and holding her up with her legs dangling. Shoving, yanking, and filming her in visible distress instead of helping her. Feeding her food straight from the microwave, hot enough to burn the inside of her mouth. As the footage is cataloged, the detectives backfill the months before October with paperwork and testimony. The pattern that emerges is as procedural as it is tragic. May 2020. Daycare staff, worried by bruises to the face and ears and other marks on the body, file a child abuse report. Police visit but close the case for lack of clear evidence. June 29, 2020. A family acquaintance reports the child was left alone in a car for a prolonged period in summer heat. A delay in securing CCTV means the footage is overwritten. The case is closed again. September 2020. After a prolonged absence from daycare, across July-September, teachers take Jong-in to a pediatrician who documents severe undernourishment and bruising and urges immediate separation from the home. Instead, the parents bring her to another clinic where she's diagnosed with a mouth infection. She is returned home. None of those earlier reports can be undone. What investigators can do is reconstruct the final days precisely. They lock the timeline. October 12th, daycare. Staff observe she cannot stand and struggles to drink. The adoptive mother visits briefly and leaves. October 13th, 8:46, 9:01 a.m. Phone videos show the child unsteady and crying. Neighbor hears heavy thuds, brief exchange at the door. 10:19 a.m. Mother drops off the older child at daycare, then lingerie shop stop. Late morning, driver observes the toddler, pale, unresponsive, ambulance suggestion refused. ER arrival, cardiac arrest, unsuccessful resuscitation, immediate police notification, autopsy, severe blunt abdominal trauma, pancreatic rupture, massive internal bleeding with approximately 80% of her total blood volume found in the abdominal cavity, multiple fractures, both acute and healing, extensive bruising across face, neck, torso, arms, thighs, calves, and ankles. Oral burns consistent with ingestion of scalding food, evidence of a prior major assault within the preceding 3 to 5 days. Interviews circle back to the apartment. Detectives ask about discipline, food, routines, medical visits, who fed the child, and when. They match statements against timestamps on videos, against checkout slips and CCTV. Inconsistencies stand out. Why film a child in obvious distress instead of seeking immediate care? Why stops and errands while a toddler at home is deteriorating? Why refuse the ambulance? The questions pile up and answers don't reconcile with the forensic physics of injury. The autopsy gives the investigators a foundation: how the injuries happened. The digital evidence adds when and how often. The daycare and medical records provide who raised alarms and when they were missed. Piece by piece, a prosecutable picture comes into focus. Beyond the incidents that reached authorities, further investigation uncovered patterns of neglect and abuse that had gone unreported at the time. Jong-in was often locked alone in a dark room every evening after 7 p.m., and during her 2-month absence from daycare, she was repeatedly left alone in the home for more than 3 hours at a time. CCTV footage from the apartment elevator would later reveal a disturbing pattern in the adoptive mother's behavior toward the child. In one recording, she is seen gripping the stroller and shaking it violently, the confined space of the elevator making the motion look even more jarring. On another occasion, cameras captured her holding the toddler by the neck with both hands, as if she were nothing more than an object to be carried. Perhaps most chilling was a separate incident in which she supported the child's entire weight with just one hand around her neck and let her stand on the handle of the elevator. Each scene played out in silence on the grainy footage, but the cruelty in those moments was unmistakable. Meanwhile, word spreads. By early January 2021, an investigative broadcast, SBS's Unanswered Questions, lays out the chain of warnings and the forensic overview in a way the public can't ignore. The program's narrative mirrors the detective's timeline: 3 reports before October, no protective action, medical findings incompatible with accident. The reaction is instant and national. The hashtag #SorryJong-in surges. Crowds gather with placards outside police stations and prosecutors' offices. The case, already urgent to investigators, becomes a public mandate. Inside the agency's briefing rooms, the scrutiny is intense. The National Police Agency issues a public apology for failing to protect a child whose danger was repeatedly signaled. Leadership changes follow at the local level. For the case team, that mea culpa doesn't change the task. They are past the point of doubt. They are finalizing charges. In Korean Christian and legal news outlets, an allegation emerged that 2 days after Jong-in's death, the adoptive mother's family gathered for her father's birthday, Pastor Jang, and shared wine. They reportedly laughed during the gathering and talked casually. This detail does not appear in major national reports or court records, so it remains unverified. If true, it paints a chilling portrait of emotional detachment and denial. It raises a disturbing question. How could a family that present themselves as pastors, as Christians, as moral leaders respond to a child's death with celebration instead of grief? If the allegation is accurate, it reflects a deep fracture between their public image and their private reality. A willingness to maintain appearances of joy and normalcy, even when tragedy demands accountability and mourning. For the adoptive mother, prosecutors move beyond abuse resulting in death. The mechanism and degree of injury, especially the pancreatic tear and hemorrhage, support the inference of lethal force. For the adoptive father, the focus is abuse and neglect, the pattern of failure to act, the missed injuries, the missed care, the child kept in harm's way. Both are notified. Interrogations sharpen, devices remain impounded, videos logged, transcripts prepared. In the evidence room, there is a brutal clarity to what remains. Scans, photographs, timelines, a grid of stills clipped from hundreds of short clips. A phone log that traces a morning of ordinary errands set against a child's collapse. Medical notes that read like a ledger of pain. The investigators do not have to speculate about emotion or motive. The injuries and timestamps are their language. The body has spoken. The digital record has spoken. The witnesses, teachers, neighbors, clinicians, a taxi driver, have spoken. The charges are filed, and the case steps from the fluorescent light of the incident room toward the bright public glare of court. What comes next will decide responsibility, assign sentences, and test whether a system that failed to act in time can at least name what happened and ensure it is seen. The trial opened under the full weight of public outrage. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered with placards, candles, and the hashtag Sorry Jong-in pinned to their jackets. Inside, the air was clinical. Rows of benches, the heavy scrape of chairs, the shuffle of papers. But the details to come would strip that veneer away. The prosecution's case was anchored in forensic fact. In January 2021, the National Forensic Service concluded that 16-month-old Jong-in died from catastrophic internal bleeding caused by extreme blunt force. The pancreas was torn nearly in two, the mesentery crushed, injuries that, in the words of one examiner, could only come from being stomped on multiple times by an adult. Lee Jong-bin, a professor at Gachon University of Medicine and Science, told the court that the pattern of injury strongly indicated feet, not arms, had delivered the blows. One possible reason, he suggested, was that the adoptive mother had undergone breast surgery and might have avoided lifting or throwing with her upper body. From the witness stand, another doctor, one who had examined more than 3,800 bodies in 2 decades, said this was the worst case of pediatric abuse he had ever seen. He had never once encountered a ruptured pancreas in a child before Jong-in. She was 79 centimeters tall, 8 kilograms in weight, already weakened from months of earlier assaults. In his professional judgment, 2 strong strikes to the abdomen in that state would be fatal. Based on tissue analysis, the team believed she had sustained another severe beating 3 to 5 days before her death, spending her last days in unrelenting pain so intense that even breathing would have hurt, explaining her eerie silence in daycare the day before she died. The prosecution did not mince words. They called for the death penalty for the adoptive mother, citing 8 months of sustained violence following the child's January 2020 adoption. They demanded 7 years and 6 months for her husband for knowingly allowing the abuse to continue. "We cannot even imagine the physical and mental pain she had suffered," one court statement read. The victim died 8 months after she was adopted, suffering from violence during that time. As the trial progressed, the court addressed motive. Reports from Korean media revealed that the couple had adopted Jong-in specifically as a companion for their 4-year-old biological daughter. It was not a spontaneous act. Adoption had been discussed during their courtship, framed in terms of faith and family completeness. But in practice, the relationship between adoptive mother and child deteriorated quickly. To the public, and to investigators, it was incomprehensible. Why bring a child into your home only to subject her to cruelty? Journalists speculated about displaced anger, unmet emotional needs, or a desire to shield the biological child from harm by directing hostility toward the adoptee. Yet no clinical psychiatric report was ever made public, leaving these as troubling questions without definitive answers. In court, Jang denied stomping on Jong-in or throwing her to the floor. "I will accept any punishment," she said, according to nooses, but maintained that the fatal injuries were not intentional. The jury and later the appellate judges were unmoved by her denial. The physical evidence spoke louder, the videos retrieved from the home, the burns in the mouth from scalding food straight from the microwave, the repeated bruising, the fractures both fresh and healing. May 2021, first verdict. The Seoul Southern District Court sentenced the adoptive mother to life in prison for murder and child abuse, and the adoptive father to 5 years for neglect. Both were ordered to complete 200 hours of child abuse treatment and banned from working in any children-related organization for 10 years. November 26, 2021, appeal decision. The Seoul High Court reduced the adoptive mother's sentence from life to 35 years. They upheld the adoptive father's 5-year term, but reversed his conviction for direct child abuse, finding him not guilty of actively participating in the assaults. Instead, they judged him guilty of failing to act despite being aware of the abuse. The additional penalties remained: 200 hours of treatment, a decade-long ban from children-related work. The appellate ruling again emphasized the prolonged suffering. The victim died 8 months after she was adopted, suffering from violence during that time. We cannot even imagine the physical and mental pain she had suffered. April 28, 2022, Supreme Court. The sentences were finalized. 35 years for the adoptive mother, 5 years for the adoptive father. The death penalty the prosecution sought never materialized, but the symbolic weight of the terms was clear. In a country where child abuse cases often drew lighter punishment, this was a statement. The brutality could not be minimized. 3 separate abuse reports by daycare staff, a family acquaintance, and a pediatrician had gone unheeded. Police had delayed securing CCTV. Medical professionals had been overruled. Child protection agencies had failed to intervene decisively. Every lapse became part of the national conversation. In the months after sentencing, reforms were pushed through, abolishing parents' legal right to use corporal punishment, mandating faster police intervention in child abuse reports, tightening adoption agency oversight, and expanding mandatory education on child welfare for law enforcement and educators. These were systemic changes born directly from Jong-in's case, her name invoked in legislative debates as a rallying cry. Still, for many, the reforms came with a bitter edge. The haunting details remained. A baby's final days in pain so severe she could barely move. The cold efficiency of recorded neglect. The flat denial in the face of forensic certainty. It was the contrast that stayed with people. The image of a family who had opened their home to a child under the banner of love, only to become the architects of her suffering. Her story is closed in court. But in the hearts of many, Jong-in's cry still echoes. We are sorry. We should have protected you.